There is a troop of olive baboons living on the edge of a woodland in East Africa. About 60 of them. They move together through the acacia scrub each morning, foraging, grooming, squabbling over scraps, keeping watch for leopards. From a distance, they look like any other baboon troop. But something happened here that researchers have spent decades trying to fully understand. Something that almost never happens in the primate world. The dominant male, the biggest, the most aggressive, the one who had held the top position through sheer physical intimidation, was removed from the troop. Not by a rival male, not by a predator, not by injury or disease forcing him out. He was expelled by the group itself. And the extraordinary part is that nobody laid a hand on him. No blood was drawn. No dramatic battle took place. The troop used something far more subtle, far more coordinated, and far more fascinating than brute force to push him out. And what happened to that troop in the years that followed changed everything scientists thought they knew about baboon society, about dominance hierarchies, and about the origins of social culture in our closest primate relatives. If you want to understand how animals think, how they cooperate, how they build rules without language, and how a group of wild baboons engineered a social revolution in the middle of an African woodland, then stay right here, because this story is one of the most remarkable things ever documented in the animal kingdom. And before we get into it, if you find yourself leaning forward as this unfolds, go ahead and subscribe. There is a great deal more where this came from. To understand what happened, you need to understand what baboon society normally looks like. And the honest answer is that it looks brutal. Baboon troops are not peaceful democracies. They are rigid hierarchies built on the constant threat of violence. At the top sits the dominant male, and his position is maintained not through charm or wisdom, but through aggression. He eats first. He mates preferentially. He decides where the troop moves and when. He takes food from subordinates. He harasses females. He bites and chases lower-ranking males who step out of line. Every interaction in the troop is filtered through the awareness of where everyone stands in relation to him. Below the alpha male, other males compete constantly for rank. Coalitions form. Alliances shift. Males challenge each other through displays of size and aggression, yawning to show teeth, slapping the ground, chasing, biting. Females have their own separate hierarchy, one that is largely inherited rather than fought for, passed from mother to daughter in a line that persists across generations. A high-ranking female's daughter is treated with deference even as an infant, long before she has done anything to earn it. The troop this story is about was observed for years by behavioral ecologist Robert Sapolsky and his colleagues. They were studying stress hormones in wild baboons. They drew blood samples, measured cortisol levels, tracked social interactions. What they found in normal baboon troops was consistent with everything already known. High-ranking males had lower stress hormones. Low-ranking males were chronically stressed. The social hierarchy was bad for the health of anyone at the bottom of it. The more aggressive a male was, the better he did. The system rewarded cruelty. And then, in the mid-1980s, something happened that nobody predicted. The dominant male of this particular troop, and several other high-ranking aggressive males, began visiting a garbage dump near a tourist lodge. This dump contained contaminated meat. The meat was infected with bovine tuberculosis. The baboons who ate from it contracted the disease, and because the dominant males monopolized the best food sources, they were the ones eating most heavily from the dump. Over the following months, nearly half the adult males in the troop died. But not just any males. Specifically, the most aggressive, highest-ranking males. The bullies. The enforcers. The males who had built their position on intimidation. What was left was a troop in which the adult male population had been fundamentally altered. The males who survived were, by the standards of baboon society, the more tolerant ones, the less aggressive ones, the ones who had been pushed to the periphery of the hierarchy precisely because they were not the most ruthless. And now, they were what remained. What Sapolsky and his colleagues documented in the years that followed was something that should not have been possible according to the prevailing understanding of baboon behavior. The troop developed a different culture, not metaphorically, literally a different set of social norms, a different behavioral baseline, a different emotional atmosphere. The surviving males groomed females far more than was typical. Male-female affiliative behaviors increased dramatically. Males spent more time in relaxed proximity to each other. Stress hormones dropped across the board, including among low-ranking individuals. The troop became measurably less stressful to live in. And when new males migrated into the troop, as young males always do when they reach adolescence and leave their birth group, something even more remarkable happened. Those incoming males who had grown up in normal, aggressive baboon troops elsewhere gradually adopted the behavioral norms of this troop. They groomed more. They were less aggressive. They deferred more readily to females. The culture was not just maintained, it was transmitted. It was contagious. The troop had, in effect, expelled the culture of dominance through aggression, along with the individual males who had embodied it. And they had replaced it with something that functioned better for nearly everyone inside it. But now let us go back to the moment before the disease. Because the garbage dump and the tuberculosis explain the mechanism by which the aggressive males were removed. They do not explain the full social dynamics that either preceded that event or the extraordinary choices made in the immediate aftermath. And they do not fully explain the earlier incidents, documented in other baboon troops in other locations, in which a dominant male was pushed out without any pathogen doing the work for the group. Because this has happened more than once, and in some of those cases, the process was entirely social. The question of how a baboon troop manages to expel a dominant male without a fight is really a question about collective action. It is a question about how 60 animals with no shared language, no explicit planning, and no formal governance mechanism manage to coordinate their behavior so precisely that one individual finds his position untenable without anyone ever confronting him directly. It requires understanding something fundamental about how social pressure works in animal groups, and it turns out that baboons are extraordinarily good at it. A dominant male baboon maintains his position through something researchers call the threat system. He does not need to fight all the time. He needs to fight occasionally, and win, so that every other member of the troop calibrates their behavior based on the likely consequences of crossing him. Every baboon in the troop carries a working model of the hierarchy in its head. They know who can beat whom. They know whose support they can count on and whose they cannot. And they adjust their behavior continuously based on that model. This is why so much of primate social life looks like posturing. The threat yawn, the ground slap, the stare. These are not random expressions. They are information. They are updates to the mental hierarchy maps that every individual is running. When the dominant male yawns and exposes his canines, he is not necessarily about to bite anyone. He is refreshing everyone's memory of the cost of defiance. The male's power depends entirely on other animals believing in it. And this is the key insight. The dominant male does not hold his position because he is physically capable of defeating every other animal in the troop simultaneously. He holds it because the other animals collectively behave as if he could. His dominance is, at its foundation, a shared fiction, a consensus, and like all consensuses, it can be withdrawn. In a normal baboon troop, withdrawing that consensus is extraordinarily dangerous for any individual who tries it. Challenge the alpha, and you face retaliation not just from him, but potentially from his allies, the males who benefit from the current hierarchy and who will defend it to protect their own positions. The system is self-reinforcing, which is why it so rarely changes through direct challenge. But what if the challenge is never direct? Field observations of multiple baboon troops have revealed a pattern that researchers have called the quiet erosion of dominance. It does not happen overnight. It happens through an accumulation of tiny behavioral shifts, each one too small to warrant retaliation, but collectively amounting to a profound renegotiation of the social contract. It begins with females. Female baboons are not passive participants in the dominance hierarchy. They have their own alliances, their own political intelligence, their own capacity for collective action. A female baboon cannot individually challenge a dominant male. But females who form tight coalitions can do something the dominant male cannot easily counter. They can simply stop giving him what his position requires. When a dominant male approaches a female who is feeding, she normally gives way, she moves, she submits. She reinforces the hierarchy with every such interaction. But when females begin to respond differently, when they hold their ground more, when they return the male's gaze instead of looking away, when they call for support from nearby individuals when he threatens them, the cumulative effect is a male who has to work harder and harder to get less and less. And the thing is, he cannot beat all of them. Not at once, not every time. Researchers have observed sequences in which a dominant male attempts to displace a female from a food source, and instead of her simply moving, nearby females look up. They orient toward the confrontation. They do not necessarily intervene directly, but their attention, their readiness, their visible presence changes the calculation for the male. He now has to factor in not just her individual resistance, but the possibility of escalation involving multiple animals. The cost of the interaction goes up. He may still succeed, but the margin narrows. Now multiply this across dozens of interactions per day, across weeks and months. The male's position is not being attacked, it is being drained. The continuous low-level reinforcement that normally keeps the hierarchy rigid starts to leak. And the male, whose entire behavioral strategy is calibrated for a world in which the hierarchy is firm, begins to show signs of stress. This is measurable. Researchers have tracked cortisol levels in males going through this kind of social erosion. Their stress hormones rise. They become more reactive, more erratic. They lash out at animals they would previously have ignored. Paradoxically, this increase in aggression often accelerates their decline rather than reversing it, because it alienates the peripheral allies whose tolerance was quietly propping up their position. The females are not done. One of the most powerful tools in the Baboon social toolkit is grooming. This is not just hygiene. Grooming is social currency. It is alliance maintenance. It is the physical expression of trust and affiliation. A male who grooms widely and is groomed widely has a network. That network is his real source of security. When allies come, it is because of the investment made in those relationships. When a dominant male's grooming relationships begin to contract, when females who used to groom him start redirecting that attention elsewhere, when the time they spend in his proximity diminishes, when he increasingly finds himself grooming in isolation, he is losing something he may not even consciously recognize as critical. He is losing the connective tissue of his social world. And this redirection of social investment is not random. The females who shift away from the dominant male tend to shift toward specific other males. Males who have demonstrated what researchers now sometimes call alternative male quality. Not physical dominance, but things like consistency, tolerance, investment in protective relationships with females and their offspring. Males who have shown that they will defend a female from harassment, not to gain immediate reproductive access, but as part of an ongoing social relationship. Males who remember favors and return them. In short, the females are not just withdrawing from the dominant male. They are building a parallel social structure around different values. And as that structure strengthens, the dominant male's network weakens. Every animal that invests in the emerging network is one less animal available to reinforce the old one. The younger males in the troop are watching all of this carefully. Male baboons are extraordinarily attentive to social dynamics. Their survival depends on correctly reading who is rising, who is falling, and which coalitions are worth joining. A young male who aligns himself with a declining dominant male is making a bad investment. The costs of loyalty to a weakening alpha are rising, and the returns are falling. At some point, the calculus tips. And when young males begin to shift their affiliations, the dynamic accelerates. The dominant male may attempt to punish defections. He may chase males who no longer defer to him, bite those who no longer make way for him, mount aggressive displays at those who meet his gaze with indifference. But each of these attempts at enforcement now costs him something: energy, social goodwill, the appearance of control. Because here is the thing about aggressive displays. They only work if they produce the desired response. A threat display that does not cause submission is not just neutral. It is actively damaging to the displayer's authority. Every time the dominant male postures and the target of that posturing fails to fully submit, every watching animal updates their mental model of the hierarchy. The male's power is recalibrated downward, slightly each time, but consistently downward. And the male knows it. Baboons are not operating on pure instinct here. They have a form of social awareness that is genuinely sophisticated. The dominant male experiencing this kind of quiet erosion shows behavioral changes that researchers interpret as awareness of declining status. He may increase the frequency of his displays, which, as discussed, often backfires. He may attempt to form new alliances with other males, but those males are now also recalibrating their assessments of his value as an ally. He may redirect aggression onto low-ranking animals who cannot fight back, which relieves his stress temporarily, but does nothing to address the structural problem and further damages his reputation among females. Or he may begin to withdraw. This is actually how it tends to end. Not with a dramatic expulsion, not with a final confrontation, but with a male who is spending less and less time at the center of the group, who is finding fewer and fewer animals willing to sit near him, who is eating alone more often, who is following the troop rather than leading it. The social exclusion is so gradual, so distributed, so lacking in any single dramatic moment, that it is easy to miss if you are not watching closely. But it is happening. Until one day, the male is on the periphery, and then he is gone. He may leave voluntarily in the sense that the social cost of remaining has become too high. He may transfer to another troop. He may become a solitary male, which is a genuinely dangerous existence in predator-rich African habitats. Whatever his fate, the troop has achieved something extraordinary. They have reorganized their social world without any single confrontation, without any individual taking the full risk of direct challenge. The work was distributed, the risk was shared, the outcome was collective. Now, the specific case that Sapolsky's research illuminated, the tuberculosis event and its aftermath, is special because it gave researchers a rare chance to observe what happens to a baboon troop after the aggressive males are removed. Not just in the immediate term, but across years, across generations, across the arrival of entirely new males who had no memory of the original events. What they found, when they returned to the troop 10 years after the die-off, was that the behavioral culture had persisted. The troop still had lower baseline cortisol levels than comparison troops. The males were still more affiliative with females. New immigrant males were still adopting the troop's norms within months of arrival. The culture was self-perpetuating. This is genuinely remarkable. It means that the social norms that emerged from a specific historical event, the removal of the most aggressive individuals, had become independent of those individuals. The culture was no longer housed in specific animals. It was housed in the social environment of the group itself, in the expectations that animals brought to their interactions, in the immediate feedback they received when they deviated from the norm. A new male arriving in a low-aggression troop finds that aggression does not pay the way it does elsewhere. When he tries to take food from a female, she does not immediately submit. When he tries to establish dominance through threat displays, other males do not automatically defer. When he grooms and spends time in calm proximity to others, he receives affiliative responses that reinforce that behavior. The environment shapes him toward the existing norms, not through any deliberate teaching, but through the ordinary mechanism of social reinforcement. He becomes, gradually, a different kind of baboon. Not biologically different, not genetically different, but behaviorally different in ways that are deep enough and consistent enough to matter enormously for the quality of life of every animal in the troop. What does this mean? What are we actually looking at when we look at this troop? We are looking at culture. Real, transmissible, non-genetic culture in a non-human species. We are looking at a group of animals that collectively renegotiated their social contract, maintained the new terms across time, and taught those terms to newcomers through the medium of social experience rather than explicit instruction. This is significant, far beyond the study of baboons. It is significant for what it tells us about the deep roots of human social life. Because human beings are also primates. We also live in groups. We also maintain hierarchies. We also have the capacity for collective action that redistributes power without necessarily producing direct confrontation. We also create cultural environments that shape the behavior of newcomers, and we also face the fundamental question of whether the social structures we inherit are fixed realities or chosen arrangements that can be renegotiated. The baboons did not choose their revolution consciously. There was no meeting, no deliberation. No moment at which a female baboon stood up and announced that things were going to change. The change emerged from the accumulated decisions of many individuals, each responding to local conditions, each following their own interests, but doing so in a social environment that was itself shifting in response to their decisions. This is how culture works, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet accumulation of individual choices, each one small enough to fly under the radar of enforcement, but collectively powerful enough to transform the world. There is something else in this story that deserves attention, and it is something that often gets overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements. The role of the females was not passive. It was not merely reactive. The females in this troop were active political agents. They had their own intelligence about the social situation. They had their own preferences about how the troop should function, and they used the tools available to them: selective affiliation, grooming allocation, collective attention, coalition formation, to push the troop toward a social environment they collectively preferred. This matters because there has been a long tendency in the study of animal social behavior to frame females as prizes or resources that males compete over, rather than as agents who are themselves making strategic decisions about which males to support, which social norms to reinforce, and which directions to push the group. The baboon research, and a great deal of subsequent primate research, has made increasingly clear that this framing is wrong. Females are not passive. They are often the primary architects of the social environment in which everyone lives. When researchers look at primate groups that have unusually low rates of male-on-male and male-on-female aggression, they consistently find strong female coalition structures underneath. The females are not being protected from aggression by tolerant males. The females are generating a social environment in which intolerant males cannot gain traction. The causality runs in the opposite direction from the traditional framing. This has echoes in many other species. Female elephants maintain the memory of the herd and make decisions about movement and resource use. Female lions coordinate hunts and defend territorial boundaries. Female dolphins maintain multi-generational social networks and transmit foraging techniques across generations. Again and again, when researchers look closely, they find that the females are doing an enormous amount of work to shape the social environment. Work that has been systematically underestimated because it does not look like the dramatic, visible, easily measurable aggression that tends to capture attention. The baboon story is a window into this, a moment where the usually invisible work of female coalition politics became suddenly, dramatically visible because of the historical accident of the tuberculosis die-off. The disease removed the aggressive males. But something in the female social structure ensured that the resulting low-aggression environment was maintained and transmitted rather than simply filling in again with the next generation of the most aggressive available males. That something was culture, social norms encoded in behavior, expectations that shaped experience, a way of being a baboon that had become, for that particular troop in that particular woodland, the natural order of things. Let us talk about what this looked like on the ground, day to day, in the years after the change. When researchers observed the troop a decade after the tuberculosis event, the first thing that struck them was the grooming. In a typical baboon troop, grooming between males and females tends to follow fairly predictable hierarchical patterns. High-ranking males receive more grooming. Low-ranking individuals groom upward. The grooming network maps onto the dominance hierarchy. In this troop, the grooming network looked different. There was more cross-rank grooming, more grooming between individuals who, by normal baboon standards, had no particular dominance relationship to maintain. More grooming that seemed to be happening because the animals involved simply liked being near each other. This is not a small thing. Grooming in primates releases endorphins. It lowers heart rate. It reduces cortisol. It physically calms the animals involved. A troop in which grooming is widely distributed is a troop in which the physical benefits of social contact are widely distributed. It is a healthier troop in a very literal biochemical sense. The spatial patterns were also different. In many baboon troops, who sits near whom reflects status anxieties. Low-ranking animals maintain safe distances from high-ranking ones to reduce the risk of inadvertent provocation. The social space of the troop is not neutral. It is organized by fear. In this troop, the spatial clustering was looser. Animals of different ranks sat in closer proximity without tension. The social space was more permeable. Feeding was calmer. The frantic scanning and quick retreating that low-ranking animals in aggressive troops engage in was less pronounced. Animals at the bottom of the hierarchy were not spending as much of their cognitive and physiological resources on threat monitoring because there were fewer threats to monitor. This freed up resources for other things, for exploration, for play, for the kind of relaxed investigation of the environment that is associated with learning in many species. The troop, in effect, had more cognitive bandwidth available to it because so much less of that bandwidth was being consumed by the management of social threat. And the effects on reproduction were measurable. Females in lower stress social environments have higher rates of successful pregnancies, higher infant survival rates, and infants who develop faster and show more exploratory behavior. The social environment the troop had created was producing measurable biological benefits that compounded across generations. The troop was not just a nicer place to live, it was a more successful place to live in the cold evolutionary calculus of survival and reproduction. Now step back even further. because there is a question hanging over all of this that we have not yet addressed directly. Why does the aggressive, high-dominance social structure exist at all, if the low-aggression structure works better for more individuals? The answer is that the aggressive structure works better for the individual at the top of it. Not for the troop, for one specific animal. And in the evolutionary competition between individual males, the capacity for aggression and dominance has historically been strongly selected for. A male baboon who cannot fight, cannot threaten, cannot intimidate, does not reproduce. Not because the females prefer aggressive males in some abstract sense, but because in a social environment where aggressive males dominate, any male who is less aggressive than the prevailing standard gets pushed out of access to mates. This is the deep trap at the heart of many dominance hierarchies. The system is bad for most of the participants. It generates chronic stress, elevated cortisol, poor health outcomes, and shortened life expectancy for everyone except the top 1 or 2 individuals. But it is self-perpetuating because defecting from it individually is too costly. No single animal can opt out without paying a severe price. The system can only change if enough animals opt out simultaneously, which requires either a catastrophic external disruption, like a disease that removes the most aggressive individuals, or a gradual, distributed, coordinated social shift of exactly the kind the females of these troops sometimes engineer. This is, if you think about it carefully, a classic collective action problem, the kind of problem that has been the central puzzle of political philosophy and game theory for centuries. How does a group of self-interested individuals escape a social arrangement that is bad for most of them when any individual who defects from it unilaterally pays a high cost? The baboons solve it, the way many revolutionary changes get made in human societies too. Not through a single dramatic confrontation, through the quiet, cumulative, distributed erosion of the social consensus that props the old arrangement up, through the gradual reallocation of social investment, through the creation of an alternative structure that eventually becomes more rewarding than the old one, until the old arrangement simply ceases to have enough participants to sustain itself. There is one more element to this story that researchers have found genuinely puzzling in the best possible way. Male baboons are, by the time they reach adulthood, substantially larger than females. In some species, the size dimorphism is even more extreme than in baboons, but baboon males are still significantly more powerful physically than the females they live with. The females cannot, in a direct physical confrontation, defeat the dominant males, and yet the females are able to reshape the social environment in ways that effectively remove those males from power. This disconnect between physical power and social power is one of the most interesting things in all of primate research. It suggests that in social species with sufficient cognitive complexity, physical strength is not the ultimate currency of social life. Information is. Relationships are. The ability to build and maintain coalitions is. The ability to coordinate behavior with others across time and space, without explicit communication, is. In this troop, the females won not because they were stronger. They won because they were better at the deeper game. They were better at managing relationships. They were better at reading the social environment and adjusting their behavior accordingly. They were better at distributing the risks and costs of resistance so that no single individual was exposed to more than she could absorb. They won because they understood, in some embodied, pre-linguistic sense, that their real power lay not in any individual capacity, but in the collective intelligence of the group. And the dominant male lost not because he was weak. He lost because his entire strategy was built on the assumption that individual physical dominance was the ultimate source of social power. He lost because that assumption was wrong. It had always been wrong. It had just been wrong in a way that was hidden from view as long as the females were individually compliant and the alliance structures that supported him held. When those structures stopped holding, his physical strength was not enough to rebuild them. You cannot beat a social consensus into existence. You cannot threaten a culture into being. The only way to maintain the kind of position he had held was through the willing participation of the other animals in the troop. And when that participation was withdrawn, nothing remained. He was not expelled by force. He was made irrelevant. There are a few other remarkable case studies from the primate literature that add layers to this picture. In some troops of Japanese macaques, a species closely enough related to baboons that the social dynamics rhyme even if the details differ, researchers have documented what they call female-led social cascades. A dominant male attempts to intimidate a female. She does not fully submit. A second female orients toward the interaction. A third moves closer. The male, now facing not one resistant female but three animals in visible proximity and apparent readiness, recalculates. He withdraws. The cascade dissolves. Nothing happened. No contact was made. No one was hurt. But the interaction was observed by every animal in range, and every animal updated their model of what that male's threat was worth, in that context, against those particular females in that configuration. The cascade is over in seconds, but its effect on the social information environment of the group persists for days or weeks. Now multiply that cascade across dozens of similar interactions. Now imagine that the females are not acting independently, but are coordinating, consciously or not, through the patterns of proximity and attention that their alliance structure creates. The male is not being confronted. He is being surrounded by a slowly tightening field of social pressure that he cannot engage with directly, because there is nothing to engage with directly. There is no challenger. There is no single moment of insubordination significant enough to warrant the full deployment of his aggressive repertoire. There is only a social environment that is gradually becoming less and less responsive to him. In studies of captive chimpanzee groups, Franz de Waal documented in great detail the way that coalitions among lower-ranking males could effectively neutralize the power of a dominant individual. In one famous case, two lower-ranking males formed a coalition so stable and mutually supportive that together they consistently outcompeted the alpha in any confrontation. Eventually, the alpha was deposed. But what was fascinating was the period leading up to that deposition. The alpha did not simply fight with the coalition and lose. He found himself increasingly isolated. Animals who had previously supported him began to hedge their bets. Females who had previously deferred to him began to spend more time near the coalition partners. The social world tilted, slowly and then all at once, and when the alpha was finally challenged directly, the fight was almost a formality. The real work had been done long before. De Waal called this political intelligence, and he meant it seriously, not metaphorically. The capacity for social calculation that chimpanzees and baboons display in managing their dominance relationships is genuinely political in the structural sense. It involves the management of alliances, the strategic deployment of social resources, the anticipation of others' responses, and the coordination of collective action toward outcomes that serve group interests, or at least the interests of most members of the group. It is not language. It is not conscious deliberation in the way humans experience deliberation, but it is not mere instinct either. It is something in between, something that is still deeply challenging for researchers to characterize precisely, because our conceptual vocabulary for thinking about mind and intention was developed primarily for humans and maps awkwardly onto other species. What we can say with confidence is that baboons and chimpanzees and many other social primates are doing something with their social intelligence that is far more sophisticated than the fight-and-win model of dominance hierarchy suggests. And the story of the troop that expelled its dominant male, whether through the slow collective pressure of female coalitions or through the historical accident of a pathogen that removed the most aggressive individuals, is one of the clearest windows we have ever had into what that sophistication looks like and what it can achieve. Back to the woodland in East Africa, back to the troop that Sapolsky's team followed for years. There is one final element of this story that deserves a long moment of quiet attention. When Sapolsky and his colleagues first documented what had happened to this troop, they faced a genuinely difficult question. What they were seeing could be interpreted as evidence that baboon social structure is far more flexible, far more shaped by culture and history than the prevailing models suggested. Or it could be dismissed as a statistical anomaly, a strange artifact of an unusual event with no broader implications. The data eventually became too strong to dismiss. The troop's behavior was consistent across time. The transmission of norms to new males was documented clearly and repeatedly. The stress hormone profiles continued to differentiate this troop from comparison troops for over a decade. And as more and more field research accumulated from other sites, the picture that emerged was of baboon social behavior that was genuinely variable across troops, variable in ways that correlated with social history and group composition rather than just with ecology or genetics. This was a paradigm shift in the study of animal behavior. Not a dramatic one, not an overnight revolution, but a genuine shift in the assumptions researchers brought to their work. The assumption that primate social behavior was essentially fixed by biology, that the dominance hierarchy was an inevitable consequence of the reproductive interests of large, sexually dimorphic mammals, that culture was something uniquely human, these assumptions did not survive contact with what this troop was doing. What this troop demonstrated, across years of patient observation and blood sampling and behavioral coding, was that the social world of baboons is not a simple expression of biological givens. It is a construction. It is made and remade by the interactions of specific animals in specific historical contexts. It has a memory, it has inertia, it can be changed by events, and it can be changed by choices. Not conscious, deliberate choices of the kind humans make, but choices nonetheless, in the sense that they are behavioral decisions that reflect the interests and experiences of the individual animals making them. The dominant male was expelled not because the laws of nature changed, not because the females in that troop had suddenly become physically stronger than the males, not because some external authority intervened. He was expelled because the social consensus that maintained his position was quietly, systematically, collectively withdrawn. Because the animals around him gradually stopped behaving in the ways that his power required. Because the culture of the troop shifted beneath him until there was nothing left for him to stand on. And what replaced him was not another dominant male. What replaced him was a different way of being a troop. A different set of norms about how animals should treat each other, a different emotional atmosphere, a different daily experience of what it felt like to be a baboon in that particular place. That culture persisted. It was passed to newcomers. It shaped the lives of animals who had never met the original individuals who created